Five Nights at Freddy's is a horror franchise, and this is a sleep video, and I'm aware those two things sit a bit oddly next to each other, but it works, and here's why. Five Nights at Freddy's at 2 in the morning isn't frightening. Nothing's going to jump out at you. What's left once you take away the screaming and the jump scares and the 10-year-olds on YouTube is an odd story that got assembled over 12 years out of 8-bit minigames, hidden text files, and pictures posted on a website with no explanation attached. That's what we're doing tonight. Slowly. Nothing being built toward. One rule before we get going. Some of this is confirmed. Some of it is what the internet collectively decided was true. And I'll tell you which is which as we go. That distinction matters more here than in almost any other story I've covered. A subscribe is always welcome if this is your sort of thing. And if you go under before the pizzeria has even opened, that's fine. That's the intended outcome. Let's start with a beaver. In 2014, a man in Texas released a mobile game about a young beaver called Chipper, who has to chop down trees and sell the wood so his dad can turn it into lumber at the family mill. It was called Chipper and Sons Lumber Co. It was free, it was cheerful, it was aimed squarely at children, and it had a talking beaver father who gave out advice like never trusting a termite. The whole thing was about as far from horror as you can get without actually being a gardening app. It did not go well. The man was Scott Cawthon, and before any of this he had a fairly specific career. He lived in Salado, Texas, with his family. He'd been making games and animations since somewhere in the 90s, and most of what he made was Christian-oriented. In 2007, he uploaded an 8-part animated retelling of The Pilgrim's Progress to YouTube, which had already been released as a full-length film on DVD a couple of years before that. He made a game called Sit and Survive. He made one called There Is No Pause Button, and his profile picture for years afterwards came from that. He made The Desolate Hope, which is honestly a strange and interesting game in its own right, and which got through Steam Greenlight without much drama. Chipper and Sons went to Greenlight too, and got pulled about a day later, because the reviews were brutal in a very particular way. People weren't complaining about the gameplay loop or the difficulty curve. They were complaining that the characters looked wrong. The animation, the way the beavers moved, the way they interacted with each other, and held eye contact slightly too long. One reviewer described them as scary animatronic animals. Someone else called them animatronic dolls, which if you look at a screenshot of Tyke is not an unfair reading. He's got these big glassy eyes and a stiff sort of head tilt, and he holds himself like something on a rail. Cawthon has been fairly open since then about what that did to him. He told Indie Game magazine that he was heartbroken and ready to give up making games entirely. He'd been at this for over a decade at that point, mostly without much financial success, in a genre nobody was clamouring for, and the one criticism that landed hardest was that his work was accidentally creepy. And then, by his own account, something snapped. He said he thought to himself that he bet he could make something a lot scarier than that. I love this story. I know it's been told 1,000 times, and I know it's practically the franchise's founding myth at this point. But I still love it, because most creative breakthroughs don't work like this. Most of them are the result of somebody getting better at something. This one is the result of somebody deciding to lean directly into their own worst review. Fun fact, and one that gets forgotten. When he started building the horror game, he seriously considered just carrying the beaver design straight over. He mentioned this to the YouTuber Dolco in a 2018 interview. The character we now know as Foxy, the pirate one, the one behind the curtain in Pirate Cove, was very nearly an animatronic beaver, which would have been a completely different vibe. Buck teeth and a hook. He went with a fox instead. Probably the right call. Development took about 6 months. He built it in ClickTeam Fusion, which is a game-making tool that mostly gets used for two-dimensional stuff, and is not what anybody would call an industrial-grade horror engine, and he made the character models in Autodesk 3ds Max. That's a one-person pipeline, No team, no publisher, no marketing budget, no QA department. A man in Texas rendering bear faces in a modeling program and then wiring them into a fairly simple piece of software. And the design that came out of those constraints is the reason the whole thing worked. Because Cawthon couldn't build a game where you walk around. He didn't have the resources for that, and the tool he was using wasn't built for it. So he made a game where you can't move at all. You sit in a chair, you have a security camera feed. You have 2 doors, 2 lights, and a battery that everything drains. That's the entire game. Constraint doing the heavy lifting. It's one of my favourite things in any medium, and it's what's happening here. He wasn't being clever about horror theory. He was working with what he had, and what he had happened to be the exact ingredients for a very specific type of dread, which is the dread of not being able to leave and not having enough resources to keep checking. The game came out on the 8th of August, 2014. For a few days, not much happened. This is the part of the story that gets skipped, and I find it more interesting than the explosion that came after, because for a short window, Five Nights at Freddy's was just another indie horror game on Desura and IndieDB, and then Steam, sitting there, doing nothing in particular. Cawthon had no reason to believe this one would go any differently from Chipper and Sons. And then it did, and it went so differently that it's hard to overstate. We'll get into that properly in a bit. The other thing that strikes me about Cawthon is that he stayed a solo developer far longer than made any sense. Once the first game hit, he had the money and the leverage to hire a studio immediately. He didn't. He kept making them himself, in the same software, at a pace that would have destroyed a small team. There's a version of this where he takes the money and outsources everything, and instead he sat in the same room and did it again. 4 times in under a year. I find that quite admirable, actually. Slightly mad, but admirable. There's a small thing about the first game that I've never quite got over. Cawthon voiced Phone Guy himself, the character who explains the entire premise to you, who talks you through your first week on the job in this flat, apologetic, slightly overworked register, is the developer. He also voiced Phone Dude in the third game. So the voice you associate with the entire early era of this franchise, the voice that basically taught an entire generation what corporate liability language sounds like, is a bloke in Texas recording into a microphone in his own house. He's mentioned in interviews that Bonnie is the only one of his own creations that ever gave him nightmares. Not Freddy, not Foxy, Bonnie, the purple rabbit who stands slightly off to the left and whose approach you can only really track by noticing he isn't where he was. He's right, by the way. Bonnie is the worst one. We'll come back to that. His favourite Bible verse, he said, is Psalm 46:10, the one about being still, which is not a detail that has anything to do with the law, but it's the kind of thing that makes the whole enterprise feel more like a real person and less like a brand, and that's the sort of thing I'm after tonight. So that's where we start, not with a haunted pizzeria or a man in a rabbit suit or 5 missing children, with a failed beaver game, a bad review, and somebody in Texas deciding that if his work was going to be accidentally frightening, he might as well make it frightening on purpose. Everything else in this video comes from that. Now let's talk a little about what that first game actually feels like to sit inside, because I think it gets flattened in the retelling. The room you're in is small and beige, and lit by one overhead strip that never quite reaches the corners. There's a desk with a fan on it. The fan runs the entire time. It's the loudest thing in the game for long stretches, and it never stops. And after about 20 minutes, your brain stops registering it as sound and starts registering it as the absence of sound, which is a much worse thing to be listening to. There's a poster on the wall of a bear giving a thumbs up. There's a cupcake on the desk with eyes. There are children's drawings taped up around the place. Somebody has been in here before you and made an effort. On either side of you is a doorway, and each doorway has a button for a light and a button for a heavy steel shutter. Above you in the corner, is a number that tells you how much power you have left. That number is the whole game. Every camera you check costs power. Every light you flick costs power. Every second a door is closed costs power. And it costs a lot. And it costs more the more doors you've got shut at once. So the entire experience is a resource problem dressed up as a horror game. You're not really being hunted. You're doing arithmetic under mild pressure. And the arithmetic is that you have roughly enough electricity to survive the night, if you make good decisions, and absolutely not enough if you panic. Panic is expensive, that's the mechanic. I think that's a really elegant idea, and I don't think Cawthon gets enough credit for it, partly because the whole thing got buried under a decade of screaming thumbnails. The 4 animatronics all behave differently, and learning them is most of the actual play. Bonnie comes down the left side, and he doesn't follow a route so much as accumulate. Chica comes down the right and rattles around in the kitchen, which you can't see, only hear. Freddy barely moves at all for the first few nights, and then starts working his way round in the dark, and he laughs when he does it. This low chuckle that plays from somewhere off camera and tells you nothing useful about where he is. And then there's Foxy. Foxy sits behind a curtain in Pirate Cove, and he operates on a completely different logic to the other 3. He doesn't creep. He waits, and what he's waiting for is you to stop looking at him. If you neglect that camera for too long, the curtain opens, and then he's out, and then he sprints down the West Hall corridor at you, and you have about a second and a half to shut the door. So you've got 2 failure states pulling in opposite directions. Watch the cameras too little, and Foxy comes. Watch them too much, and you run out of power, and every door in the building opens at once, and the lights go off. And you sit in the dark, listening to the Toreador March. That's the bit everyone remembers. Power hits 0, everything dies, and then from the left doorway, there's Freddy's face, lit up, playing this tinny music box rendition of a piece from Carmen. And it goes on. It's not a jump scare, it's a countdown of unknown length, and you sit there watching a bear's face flicker in the doorway with no idea whether it's 3 seconds or 30. That's the best thing in the game, and it's the thing that's least like a horror game. It's just waiting. Since we're on the subject of things that aren't really horror, let's talk about the phone calls. Every night, at about 2 minutes past midnight, your phone rings and a man leaves you a message. He's already dead, in the sense that he recorded these before you got there, and he is very obviously not going to be around for long. And what he talks about is procedure. He talks about company policy. He explains that the animatronics are on a free roaming mode at night because their servos lock up if they're left off too long, which is not a lie exactly, but is doing an enormous amount of work. He explains that if they see you after hours, they won't recognize you as a person. They'll see an endoskeleton without a costume on. And company policy on an endoskeleton without a costume is to forcibly stuff it into the nearest suit, which is full of crossbeams and wires and animatronic devices. And he trails off a bit here. And then he says the only part of you that would likely see the light of day again would be your eyeballs and your teeth. And then he wraps up cheerfully and tells you to have a good night. It's the best writing in the entire franchise, and it's a voicemail. The horror isn't the bear. The horror is that somebody wrote a script for onboarding new hires, and the script includes a section on what happens to your teeth. He also, at one point, tells you not to worry about the animatronics and to conserve power if anything goes wrong, which is the single most corporate sentence ever written. I laughed the first time I heard it. It's still funny. It's also, if you sit with it for a second, quite grim, because it means somebody at Fazbear Entertainment has done the maths on staff turnover and decided this is fine. The law comes in through the walls, and it comes in slowly. There are newspaper clippings that appear on the wall in the East Hall corner, and you only see them if you happen to be looking at that camera at the right moment, and they change. They're low resolution and half illegible, and you basically have to brighten them in an image editor to read them properly, which a great many people did. They described children who went missing at a Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, a man who lured them into a back room, bodies never found, and then a later clipping about the restaurant closing after reports of foul odours and blood and mucus around the eyes and mouths of the animatronic characters. That's it. That's the primary story delivery mechanism in the first game. 2 pieces of newsprint you have to squint at. There's a version of this where that's just an Easter egg. What actually happened is that it became the foundation of an 11-year franchise because people found it and could not let it go. And then there's Golden Freddy, who I think might be the single strangest thing Cawthon ever put in a game. He's not on the roster, he's not in the tutorial, he doesn't have a camera. What he has is a poster in a specific hallway that occasionally changes into a yellow bear's face. And if you then look back at your office, there is a limp yellow suit sitting on the floor in front of you, and it does not move. And if you don't put the camera back up immediately, you get a face full of static and the game crashes. Not a game over screen, a crash. The window shuts. You can also summon him deliberately by typing 1987 on the custom night AI screen, which is a call forward to a date tied to the byte of 87 that Phone Guy briefly mentions and which would only be explored in more detail a few months later. There's more of this than people remember. Posters change when you're not looking. Occasionally you'll flick to a camera and find one of the animatronics staring directly down the lens instead of standing where it should be. There's a hallucination frame of a Freddy head that appears for a fraction of a second. Most of it doesn't do anything. Most of it isn't a mechanic. It's all texture, and it's all designed to make you feel like the building is aware of you in a way the rules don't cover. My honest opinion, having gone back to it, is that the first game is better than its reputation. It got so thoroughly absorbed into internet culture that people talk about it as a jumpscare delivery system, and it isn't. It's a very tight, very cheap, very well-tuned little machine about rationing electricity while a bear works out where you are. The jump scares are the least interesting part. They're the punctuation. The sentence is the waiting. Somewhere north of 120 million people have now watched a man in a chair play the first night of 5 nights at Freddy's. That's Markiplier's video. It went up in August 2014, days after the game came out, and it's called Warning, Scariest Game in Years, in capitals, because that's what worked on YouTube in 2014. He had somewhere around 3 million subscribers at the time. By the end of the following year, he had 10. I want to talk about why the fit was so exact, because I don't think it was luck, or at least not only luck. Think about what a Let's Play video actually looks like as a piece of composition. You've got game footage filling the frame and a small box in the corner with a person's face in it. For most games, that's a slightly awkward arrangement, because the game is moving and the camera is moving and there's a lot competing for your attention. Now think about what 5 Nights at Freddy's looks like. A static shot of a small room, a camera feed that doesn't pan, long stretches where nothing changes at all. It is visually almost a still image with a face in the corner of it, which means the face becomes the show. The game supplies tension, and the person supplies everything else. And the format that had been slightly awkward for 2 years suddenly had a piece of software that was purpose-built for it without anybody intending that. There's a second thing, and it's the reason this became a children's franchise rather than a horror one. There's no gore, there's no blood on screen, no dismemberment, no swearing, nothing a parent walking past a laptop would immediately shut down. The scares are loud and sudden and completely bloodless, so a 9-year-old could watch this and did in enormous numbers, and the horror was strong enough to feel like a transgression without actually being one. That combination, watchable format plus permission structure, is why it moved the way it did. PewDiePie played it. Jacksepticeye played it. Everyone with a camera and a microphone played it, because the videos performed and the game was cheap and short. and the algorithm at the time rewarded exactly this. Cawthon, to his credit, or possibly to his own detriment, did not sit on this. Five Nights at Freddy's 2 came out in November 2014. That's about 3 months after the first one. Five Nights at Freddy's 3 arrived in March 2015. Five Nights at Freddy's 4 landed in July 2015. That's 4 games in 11 months and 15 days, and it got him into the Guinness Book of Records for the largest number of sequels released in a year. I've thought about that pace quite a lot, and I still can't fully get my head around it. That's not a team. That's one man in the same modelling software, building new animatronics and new rooms and new mechanics, while the previous game is still the most uploaded thing on the platform. There are studios of 40 people who don't ship 4 games in 3 years. And the games are different from each other, which is the part that impresses me most. The second one takes your doors away entirely and hands you a mask and a hand-cranked music box. The third one has exactly one real threat in it and fills the rest of the building with hallucinations. The fourth one takes you out of the pizzeria altogether and puts you in a child's bedroom with no cameras at all, listening at door frames. That's not a man cloning his own product. That's a man who's actively bored and keeps changing the rules on himself. Now, since we're on the subject of things happening at speed, let's talk about the fandom, because it assembled itself with alarming efficiency. The Living Tombstone put out a song, then another one, then a lot of people put out songs, and for about 2 years you could not open YouTube without a FNAF track in the sidebar. There were animations, there were animatics, there was an entire deviant art ecosystem of original characters, and if you were online in that period, you will remember the specific flavour of that. And if you weren't, honestly, be grateful. There were fan games, hundreds of them on Game Jolt of wildly varying quality, and Cawthon's attitude toward them was unusually relaxed for someone sitting on a valuable property. He let them exist. Years later, he went further than that and started actually funding some of them, which is not a normal thing for a rights holder to do. And then there's the teaser culture, which is the bit I find most interesting and which I don't think has a real parallel anywhere else. Cawthon's website, scottgames.com, was a black page with a picture on it. That's all. When a new game was coming, he'd change the picture, and there would be no announcement, no press release, no accompanying text explaining anything. Just a new image, sitting there. And people learned that if you took that image into a photo editor and cranked the brightness up, there was usually something else in it. A second figure standing in the dark behind the first one. A word, a face. So the release cycle for these games involved thousands of people downloading a JPEG and adjusting the exposure on it, which is an absolutely mad way to run a marketing campaign. And it worked better than any marketing campaign has any right to. Sometimes the clues were in the page source. There was a stretch where the HTML contained the line about what paragraph 4 was, which sent everyone off hunting through a previous post looking for a fourth paragraph. That's it. That's the whole message. Go and count paragraphs. I've got a lot of affection for this because it's the opposite of how you're supposed to do it. The received wisdom is that you make things clear and you make them accessible and you don't put obstacles between your audience and your product. He put nothing but obstacles there, and the obstacles became the community's favourite part. One thing that's easy to miss from this distance is how much of the actual story got worked out by people who weren't playing the games. If your route into all of this was watching someone else play, you were never going to find the newspaper clippings. You'd never brighten a teaser. So there was a whole secondary layer of people whose entire job, unpaid and self-appointed, was to go and find that stuff and then explain it to everybody else. We'll talk about that properly later on, because it turned into something quite strange. What I'll say for now is that the distribution model for this franchise was other people's reactions, and I don't think there's a clean parallel. There are games that got popular on YouTube. There are games that got popular because of one particular video, but there's something specific about a horror game where the primary product being sold is watching somebody else be frightened. and where the developer then leaned into that so hard that he started hiding secrets that only worked if the community pooled its efforts. He built a game for one person alone in a room, and then it became an enormously communal thing. I don't think he planned that. I'm not sure anybody could have. Right, let's go back a long way and start with an object, because the object is the most interesting thing in this entire story, and it's a costume. A spring-lock suit works like this. You've got an animatronic character, a full one, with a metal endoskeleton inside it, and all the motors and rods and joints that make it move. Normally that's a machine and a machine only, and there's no room inside it for anything else, because the inside is full of animatronic. But if you build the thing cleverly, you can make all of that hardware retract. The rods pull back against the inner walls of the suit and lock into place with a set of spring catches, and that leaves a cavity in the middle roughly the size and shape of a person. Then a person climbs in, and the suit becomes a costume, and a member of staff can walk around the restaurant being Fredbear, crank the springs the other way, and the machinery comes back out, and it's an animatronic again. One character, two moders. From a design point of view, it's clever, and in universe, it was the thing that made the company special. The problem is the spring catches, and it's not a subtle problem. They're held under load the entire time somebody's inside. If they're jostled hard enough, or if moisture gets into the mechanism, they release, and everything that was pulled back against the walls comes forward at speed, which is a serious problem when the reason there's space in there is that you're standing in it. The company's own training material is quite specific about this. Keep your hands and feet away from the walls. Avoid contact with the spring locks. Don't breathe too heavily, and don't cry. And if the mechanism does fail, staff will try to enter the room and retrieve you, but they may need to wait until morning. That's the safety briefing. Try not to cry and someone might be along in the morning. The whole horror engine of a 12-year franchise is a workplace safety hazard, and I don't think that's an accident. It's a story about a family entertainment company, where the danger was baked into the product design, and everybody kept using it anyway, because it was good for business. The place these suits lived was called Fredbear's Family Diner. It was set up by two men, Henry Emily and William Afton. Henry's the ideas one, the one who came up with the characters and the concept and the whole notion of a restaurant, where the entertainment walks around and talks to you. William's the engineer. He's the one who actually built the things, and he's specifically the one who pioneered the spring lock technology. There were two characters at the diner, Fredbear, a golden bear, and Spring Bonnie, a golden rabbit. Henry wore one, and William wore the other, and they'd walk the floor at birthday parties, being cheerful at children. Sit with that for a second. Both of the founders spent their working days inside a machine that could kill them if they laughed wrong. The diner did well enough that it grew into a proper company, Fazbear Entertainment, and well enough that Williams spun off his own outfit, Afton Robotics, to keep developing the technology. Two men with a good idea and an expanding business, in a period the games never show you directly, and which we only know about through recordings, blueprints, and things characters say years later. And then it goes wrong, and the story never really recovers from it. Here's where I need to start flagging what's confirmed and what isn't, because from this point on, the ground gets soft. What's confirmed is that William Afton started killing children. What the fandom has settled on, and what's very strongly implied without ever being spelled out, is that the first one was a girl called Charlotte Emily, Henry's daughter. She's left outside the restaurant in the rain, and she can't get back in, and William is there. Her spirit ends up in an animatronic called the marionette, or the puppet, depending on who you ask. Tall, thin, white-faced, black-bodied, with long spindly arms and a permanent, painted-on smile. She becomes, in a strange way, the most important character in the whole story, because she's the one who does something about what happens next. Whether Charlotte died before or after the other big early tragedy is actually contested. There's a line Henry delivers much later about a wound first inflicted on him, and then one he let bleed out to hurt everyone else. And most people read that as Charlotte going first and Henry's grief and inaction letting the rest happen. That's a reading. It's a good reading. It's not a confirmation. Now the other tragedy, this one is confirmed, and it has a date, 1983. A birthday party at Fredbear's. William Afton's youngest son is there, and he's terrified of the place, and he's terrified of the animatronics specifically. His older brother thinks this is hilarious and has been running a fairly relentless campaign of frightening him, wearing a foxy mask and jumping out at him, that sort of thing. At the party, the older brother and his friends grab the younger boy and lift him up and push his head into Fredbear's mouth. It's meant as a prank. Give him a good look at the thing he's scared of. The jaw is a spring-lock jaw. It closes. He survives long enough to be taken to hospital. He doesn't survive the hospital. The damage is to the child's head, and this becomes known as the bite of 83. I'm going to deliver that flatly, because it's genuinely the darkest thing in this franchise, and it doesn't need any help from me. The child is never named on screen. Not once in any game. The fandom calls him Evan, and has done for years, and there's a reasonable amount of circumstantial evidence for it, but I want to be clear that it's consensus and not canon. Most people also refer to him simply as the crying child, which is what the community landed on before any name was floating around. The fourth game is where all of this lives, and it's the strangest game in the series. By a distance, you're not in a pizzeria. You're a child in a bedroom at night, with no cameras, holding a torch, running between two door frames and a wardrobe, and listening for breathing. If you hear breathing at a door, you hold it shut. If you don't, you shine the light. Getting that wrong is how you lose. And through the whole thing, there's a plush toy of Fredbear sitting on the bed, and it talks to him. It reassures him. It tells him it will put him back together. Nobody has ever fully explained that plush. There are theories, and some of them are quite involved, and none of them are confirmed. It's one of the few unresolved things from the early games that later material has left almost entirely alone. Here's a fun detail that I think about more than I should. The spring-lock suits were eventually pulled from service, and there's a recording where a company representative explains that the suits are being retired, that the characters will no longer be used, and that certain rooms in each building are not on any map, are not to be entered, and are not to be mentioned to customers. They didn't fix the problem. They walled it up and put a note on the file. That's Fazbear Entertainment in one sentence, and it's going to keep being Fazbear Entertainment for the next 40 years of in-universe time. The thing customers noticed first was the smell. Not screaming, not a disappearance, not anything you'd put in a headline. A smell. Parents at a Freddy Fazbear's Pizza started mentioning that the animatronics had begun to smell wrong, in a way that a restaurant full of cheese and grease should have been able to cover, and somehow wasn't. And then there were reports about fluid around the eyes and the mouths of the characters. Blood and mucus is how the newspaper clipping puts it. That's the detail that got the location shut down, not the murders. The murders had already happened by then, and nobody had connected them to the building. What closed it was a hygiene complaint. I find that truly one of the better constructed pieces of horror in the whole franchise, because it's exactly how it would go. Nobody looks inside the bear. Somebody files a report about odour. So let's back up and go through what actually happened, and I'll flag the soft ground as we hit it. At some point in the mid-80s, a man walks into a Freddy Fazbear's Pizza wearing the spring Bonnie suit. Not as an employee, or at least not officially. The suit is old stock at this point, from the diner days. 5 children follow him. Of course they do. He's a friendly golden rabbit in a restaurant full of friendly characters, and following him is the correct behaviour for a child in that room. That's the horror of it. Nothing about their reaction is a mistake. He takes them into a back room and kills them. Their bodies end up inside the animatronics, and this is where the story stops being a crime and starts being whatever it is that this franchise actually is. There's a minigame in the second game called Give Gifts, Give Life, and it's about 30 seconds long, and it's in 8-bit, and it's one of the most affecting things in any of these games. You play as the puppet. You move from body to body, each child gets a present, and then each child gets a mask, and the mask is the face of one of the animatronics. And then the last screen shows golden Freddy jumping at the camera. That's the mechanism. The puppet, Charlotte, gives them somewhere to go, which means the possession in this franchise isn't a curse, and it isn't a haunting in the traditional sense. It's a decision somebody made, out of what reads pretty clearly as compassion, and it goes catastrophically wrong for everybody involved. The names. This is where I need to be careful. You'll see 5 names attached to those 5 children constantly, and you'll see them assigned to specific animatronics. Gabriel with Freddy, Jeremy with Bonnie, Susie with Chica, Fritz with Foxy, Cassidy with the golden suit. Those names come from later material and from a lot of community assembly work, and the mapping in particular is not something the games ever sit you down and state. It's very widely accepted. It's also, strictly speaking, consensus. If you go into a comment section and say it as though it were printed in a manual, someone will correct you, and they'll be technically right and quite tedious about it. There's a detail I like though, which is confirmed and which explains a mechanic. The reason the animatronics come after night guards specifically, rather than anybody who happens to be in the building, is that William Afton was wearing a security uniform when he did it. So the thing that stayed with them, the thing that survived the transfer, is a uniform. They're hunting people. They're hunting a shape. Now let's talk about the second game, because it's the one that deals with all of this most directly, and it's also the one that most people bounced off. Five Nights at Freddy's 2 is a prequel, which nobody realised at the time. It's set at a newer, bigger, brighter location, and Fazbear Entertainment has responded to everything that happened by building an entirely new generation of animatronics. They're called the Toys, and they're a corporate liability response given plastic form. Toy Freddy, Toy Bonnie, Toy Chica, smooth white plastic, rosy cheeks, big glossy eyes, designed to look as unthreatening as possible. And here's the part that I think is the best single idea in the early games. The toys have facial recognition, and they're wired into a criminal database. The company's official reasoning is child safety. They scan the faces in the room and they cross-reference them, and if a known offender walks in, the animatronic knows, which is a completely insane thing to install in a restaurant mascot. And it's also, given what happened at the last location, an entirely understandable overcorrection. They also removed your doors. The office in the second game has 3 openings and no way to shut any of them. What you've got instead is an empty Freddy head that you put on your own face. And the idea is that the animatronics see a Freddy and lose interest and wander off. So you're not defending yourself, you're doing an impression. And in the corner of the building, there's a music box, and it has to be wound remotely from your camera panel constantly. If it winds down, the puppet gets out, and the puppet cannot be stopped by a mask or anything else. I love that mechanic. It's the only one in the entire series where the threat is caused by neglect rather than by proximity. Everything else in these games is about something coming closer. That one's about you forgetting to do a small maintenance task over and over for 6 hours. The old animatronics are in the building too, in bits, in a back room, and they're a mess. Chica's jaw hangs open. Bonnie has no face at all, just an exposed metal endoskeleton head. And I maintain that's the single most upsetting design in the franchise. And Foxy has been taken apart so thoroughly that his listing in the game is just Mangle because the staff stopped bothering to reassemble him and let the children pull him apart at will. Fun detail there actually. Mangle was originally a take apart and put back together attraction. That was the pitch. Let the kids dismantle the fox. Then there's the bite of 87. This gets mentioned in passing in the very first game, by the phone. He says something about it being amazing that a person can live without the frontal lobe, and then moves on to something else entirely. The fourth game shows you a birthday party going wrong in one of the mini-games and somebody's head ending up in an animatronic's mouth. That's a different incident from 1983, and the two of them being separate is one of the fandom's great untangling projects. For years, people assumed there was one bite. There are two. The 1983 one is the child at the diner. The 1987 one happens at this location. The victim survives, and which animatronic did it has never been settled and probably never will be. Mangle is the popular answer. Toy Freddy has supporters. It's open. What gets me about this whole section of the story is the inversion at the centre of it. In most horror, the thing chasing you is the villain. Here, the things chasing you are the children, and the villain has a payroll number and a uniform and a supervisor, and he's fine. He's completely fine. He's going to be fine for a very long time. For the first 3 games, the most important character in this entire franchise is about 11 pixels tall and has no face. He shows up in the 8-bit minigames. A figure, roughly person-shaped, coloured a flat purple. No features, no expression. Sometimes he's holding something that might be a knife and might just be a badge, and the resolution is low enough that arguing about it was a legitimate community activity for about 2 years. The fandom called him Purple Guy, and that name stuck so hard that it took a very long time for anyone to start using his actual one. The purple is partly a technical thing. Cawthon's minigames use a limited palette, and the character needed to read as distinct from everything else on screen at that size. But there's a nice in-universe reading floating around too, which is that he's purple because he's mostly seen in the dark, in shadow, by children and by people who weren't looking properly. What you see in the shadows gets misunderstood. Cawthon himself put that line up as a clue in a Steam post once, which we'll come back to later on. His name is William Afton, and what makes him work as a villain, for me, is that he's never once given a satisfying explanation. There's no origin scene, no childhood trauma, no monologue where he explains his philosophy. The games have never told you why he started, and later material has hinted at motives without ever landing on one. He's an engineer with a family and a successful business who at some point began murdering children and then spent decades doing increasingly elaborate things to avoid the consequences. That's a really unusual choice for a franchise this size. Every other long-running horror property eventually explains its monster. This one just didn't, and I think it's stronger for it. Now let's talk about the safe rooms, because they're the connective tissue for everything in this part of the story. In the third game, there's a series of training tapes you find, and they're the same flat corporate register as the phone calls from the first game. And they explain that every location has a room that isn't on the map. It doesn't appear on the camera system. It's not part of any tour. Staff aren't to mention it to customers, and customers aren't to be shown it. Officially, it's for equipment storage and for the springlock suits. Then a later recording explains that these rooms are being sealed, bricked up, not emptied first, sealed with whatever's inside still inside. And you can see in the mini-games what William Afton did with that. There's a sequence where he goes back, years after the killings, and takes the animatronics apart one by one. Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, Foxy, just dismantles them in a back room, with the spirits still in them. The community reads this as him getting rid of the evidence and also getting rid of the things that had been following him, and the mini-game is called Follow Me, which is not subtle but is effective. And then the ghosts of the children corner him. They surround him, and he panics and does the only thing he can think of, which is to get inside the old golden rabbit suit, because inside the suit he isn't a person anymore, and they can't reach him. And the spring locks fail. Different versions of the story attribute it to different things. Water dripping in the room, him laughing at the moment he thinks he's got away with it. What's confirmed is the outcome. He's inside the machine when the mechanism releases, and everything that was locked back against the walls comes forward. He doesn't die quickly. That's the point of the scene. The last frame of the minigame is a suit propped against a wall with a man's eyes still visible in the mask, and then somebody bricks up the room. He's in there for 30 years. That's the setup for the third game, which is set at a horror attraction called Fazbear's Fright. Somebody has had the idea of building a haunted house out of the real thing. They've gone round the old sites, scavenging, looking for genuine artifacts, and they've found one intact animatronic in a sealed room, and they are absolutely thrilled about it. The whole game is a man being hunted by a corpse in a rabbit suit, while a marketing person on the phone tells him how good this is going to be for ticket sales. The design of the third game is the one I go back and forth on. There's exactly one thing in the building that can kill you. Everything else is a hallucination. There are phantom versions of the old animatronics, burnt and hollow-eyed, and they appear, and they scream at you, and they do nothing except mess up your systems for a few seconds. So the game is mostly about false alarms, and I understand why people find that frustrating, and I also think it's the most thematically correct thing in the series. You spend the whole game being terrified of things that aren't real, while a dangerous thing moves through the ventilation. Springtrap, incidentally, is what everybody calls him at this point. Green-yellow, torn, with a human body still visible through the gaps in the suit. It's a strong design. The tearing is doing a lot of work because it means you can see him and you can see what's inside him at the same time. Now the good ending of the third game is the bit worth staying with. If you complete all the minigames correctly, you get a sequence called the happiest day. It's a birthday table. There are children sitting at it wearing animatronic masks, and there's one more child sitting with them holding a cake, and all at once the masks come off, and the children disappear. That's it. That's the resolution of the original story. The souls are released, and in the good ending screen, the animatronic heads on the shelf have their eyes dark. And then the attraction burns down, because of course it does, and the last image is a shadowy shape in the ruins that is very clearly not gone. Which brings us to Remnant, and I'll keep this brief because it's a book's concept that leaked into the games rather than the other way round. Remnant is what you get when human soul energy fuses with metal, usually through heat or through extreme distress. It's the mechanism underneath the possession. It's why the animatronics keep their occupants. It's also, and this is the important bit, something you can move about and inject and use, which turns a supernatural phenomenon into a substance with an inventory. William Afton figured that out. That's his project. Not immortality through magic exactly. Immortality through applied engineering on a material he discovered by accident while doing something appalling. The line everybody quotes is the one he delivers just before the spring locks go, and it's 4 words long, and it amounts to a promise that he always comes back. He's been right so far, repeatedly, to the point where the franchise has had to invent new categories of thing for him to come back as. I want to flag one open question before we move on, because it matters for how you read everything after this. We do actually know that the third game happens before the 6th one. Springtrap burns in a fire at the end of both. The community has argued about the order for years, and there are reasonable arguments on both sides, including a fairly good one based on which arm he's missing. The honest answer is that it's contested, it's probably going to stay contested, and if anyone tells you they've settled it for themselves. The strangest thing about the 5th game, when it arrived in October 2016, is that it talks. Everything before it had been sparse. A voicemail at the start of the night, a few lines of text, some mini-games with no dialogue at all. You spent most of your time in silence, which was most of the point. Sister Location opens with an onboarding AI called Hand Unit chatting away at you as a lift takes you underground, and it doesn't stop. It asks you to type in your name and then tells you it's registered as something completely different and refuses to change it. It runs you through your duties in a bright customer service voice, while the lift keeps going down and the depth gauge keeps ticking over. There's a bit where it offers you a selection of entrance music, and the options get progressively more unhinged. I laughed out loud at that the first time, which is not a normal reaction to a Five Nights at Freddy's game, and that tonal shift is deliberate. The fifth game is funny in places, and then it's the nastiest thing in the entire series, and the funny parts are load-bearing. The location is Circus Baby's Entertainment and Rental, not a restaurant, a rental company. The animatronics don't live anywhere permanently. They get hired out for parties and events, and then brought back underground into a facility that is far, far larger than a company of this size would ever need. There are no customers down there. There's no restaurant floor. There's a maintenance bay and a control module and a room full of ballerinas in the dark. And there's a technician's shift that runs overnight. The characters are called the Fun Times, and they are the best designed things in this franchise by a comfortable margin. Funtime Freddy is white and pink with a face that opens in panels, and he has a hand puppet on his right arm called Bon Bon, which is a small blue rabbit, and he talks to it constantly, and it talks back. Funtime Foxy is white and pink as well, and has the same panelled face. Ballora is a ballerina with her eyes permanently closed, who dances in a dark room to her own music box theme, and who you are specifically told not to look at while she's on stage. And then there's Circus Baby, who runs the place. Orange pigtails, red cheeks, a mechanical build that opens down the front, and a voice that is calm and warm, and entirely too reasonable throughout. There are smaller things too. Biddy Babs, which are small crawling baby-like dolls that get under your desk. Minirinas, which are little ballerina puppets that attach to things. And every one of these machines has a feature that isn't in the brochure. Baby tells you about it herself, in one of the most quietly horrible monologues in any game I can think of. She describes a birthday party. She describes counting the children. She describes how she was designed to detect when exactly one child is standing alone in front of her, and how, when that happens, a compartment opens in her stomach and a claw comes out. She's not confessing. She's explaining a specification. That's the thing that makes it land. She talks about it the way you'd talk about a feature you didn't ask for and can't switch off. And then she tells you the worst part, which is that the first time it happened, it wasn't a customer. Elizabeth Afton is William's daughter. She'd been told to stay away from Baby. She'd been told repeatedly and specifically. And there's a small cutscene where she says a line about her father not letting her play with her. And the wounded confusion in it is exactly right for a child who's been told no without being told why. She goes and stands in front of Baby anyway, because obviously she does. And the claw comes out. So the man who built child abduction machinery into his own animatronics lost his daughter to one of them, and the one that killed her was the one he built for her. Or near enough. That's the domestic core of this whole thing, and it's what the fifth game is actually about underneath all the lift music. You, meanwhile, are Michael Afton. Not that anyone tells you this while you're playing. He's William's son. He's working nights in his father's facility, and the game is deliberately vague about why. The prevailing read is that he's looking for his sister, and there's decent evidence for it, but the game keeps him almost entirely silent for 4 nights and lets Hand Unit do all the talking, so you're piecing it together from an absence. The nights themselves are the least 5 nights at Freddy's thing in the series. There's barely any camera work. You crawl through vents, you reboot systems in a pitch-black room with something breathing next to you. There's an entire sequence where you have to move through Ballora's gallery by sound alone, freezing when the music gets close. And there's the spring lock sequence, which I think is the single most stressful 5 minutes in the franchise. You're inside a spring lock suit, in the scooping room, hiding, and the spring locks are winding down as you go, and there's a gauge, and you have to keep retightening them by hand while mini-arenas climb the suit. Everything the training tapes told you about hands and feet and moisture is suddenly a mechanic you're operating under time pressure. That's good design. That's taking a piece of lore you'd only ever read about and making you do it. Then there's the scooper. It's a large machine in a room called, straightforwardly, the scooping room, and Baby explains that it's for maintenance. You use it to remove an endoskeleton from a suit when the endoskeleton needs work. She makes a small joke about the name sounding like something for ice cream. The blueprints say something a bit different. They describe it working with a remnant reservoir kept at a controlled high temperature, which is what you'd need if you wanted to move something out of one machine and into another. On the last night, you follow Baby's instructions and you go into the scooping room, and you find that all 4 of the fun times have already been scooped. Their outer shells are lying about the place, empty, because they've climbed out of themselves and assembled into one thing. It's called Ennard, and it's a tangle of wires and endoskeleton parts with a plastic clown mask on the front. And it's been using Baby's voice the entire time to talk to you. And it explains quite politely that it isn't trying to hurt you. It needs to get out of this facility, and it can't do that as a pile of wire. It needs to look like a person, and then it uses the scooper on you. I'm not going to dress that up. The player character is hollowed out and worn as a disguise, and the last shot of the ending is a bathroom mirror with your own face in it and purple eyes looking back. Since we're on the subject of endings, the 5th game has an extra bit that most people miss and that recontextualizes everything. If you complete the custom night, you get a series of short cutscenes of Michael in a room, and his skin is going grey and then green over successive scenes, and he's clearly dead or extremely close to it. And in the last one, Ennard leaves him, climbs out and drags itself off into a storm drain. And then Michael gets back up. He's not alive in any normal sense at that point. Remnant, presumably, is doing the work. And he delivers a short speech to his father, saying he's going to find him. And it's the first time in 5 games that anybody has said any of these names out loud. The fandom absolutely lost it. I've watched the reaction videos from that week and they're worth a look. Fun detail before we move on. There's a running gag through the 5th game about a prize you can win, and the prize is a tub of exotic butters. That's it. That's the joke. And it's kept coming back for years afterwards, in later games, as a collectible, as an Easter egg, as a reward for a 100% completion run. Cawthon has a strange sense of humour, and I think that's underrated. This is the same game with the claw and the scooper in it, and it's also the game with the butters. Before we get to the 6th game, we should probably talk about the one that isn't a horror game at all, because it's the single funniest thing that has ever happened to this franchise. In January 2016, Cawthon released FNAF World. It's a role-playing game, turn-based combat, party of 4, overworld map, the whole arrangement. All the animatronics are rendered as small round cartoon versions of themselves, with big eyes wandering around a bright green landscape, fighting each other. It's meant to be a joke, or at least a palate cleanser, and it went badly. The reception was rough enough that Cawthon pulled it from Steam 4 days after release, and issued refunds to everyone who'd bought it, which is not a thing developers do. And then he finished it anyway, and put it out for free, and kept updating it. There's a section of that game that turned out to matter quite a lot, which nobody expected from an RPG, where you fight a cartoon chicken. There's an area you reach by getting deliberately lost in the code, and there's a character in it called Old Man Consequences, sitting by a lake, and he tells you to leave the demon to his demons and rest your own soul. People have been arguing about that fishing lake ever since. It comes back later. Of course it does. Right, the 6th game. In December 2017, a free game appeared on Steam called Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator. The store page had a cheerful cartoon logo. The screenshots showed a restaurant management interface. There was pizza, there were tables. Cawthon had, some months earlier, publicly announced that the 6th game was cancelled. He'd said he wanted to make a tycoon game instead, something light, and then he'd gone quiet. So everybody assumed this was the tycoon game, a joke release, a bit of fun. It was not a bit of fun. The first thing you do is play a small 8-bit minigame where you're Freddy delivering pizzas, and it goes wrong immediately and violently. And then the actual game starts, and it genuinely is a business simulator. You buy furniture from a catalogue. You place tables and arcade machines and animatronic stands. Every item has a stat for atmosphere, for entertainment value, for how much it costs, and crucially, for liability risk. You are running a restaurant with a liability meter. That's the joke, and it's a good one. And it's also the whole thesis of the franchise expressed as a number in the corner of a spreadsheet. Then, between shifts, something comes in off the street. The salvage sequences are the best thing in the game. An animatronic has been found. It's in the back. You can either throw it away for nothing, or you can salvage it for a few $100s. And the game is very clear that salvaging is optional and that you should probably not do it. If you do, you sit in a dark room with the thing in front of you on a trolley, holding a taser, with an audio prompt playing. You're supposed to work through a checklist, and while you do, it moves. Not much. A little at a time when you're looking at the paperwork. 4 of them come through. Scrap Baby, which is Circus Baby again, rebuilt out of scrap and worse for it. Molten Freddy, which is Ennard from the 5th game with a new face on. Lefty, a black bear with a slightly too fixed grin. And Springtrap, who at this point has been through a fire and looks it. And you keep taking them in, because the game gives you a small financial incentive, and you're running a business. The ending is where this stops being a joke entirely. You finish your last shift, and Scrap Baby starts talking. She's got a speech prepared. She's clearly been planning this for a while, and she's rather pleased with herself. And then she gets cut off mid-sentence, and a different voice comes on. It's Henry Emily. He's been the one leaving you the tapes all game. And what he explains calmly over the course of several minutes is that none of this was a restaurant. The building was bait. He built it, he advertised for staff, he made sure the salvage came in, and every single one of them walked into a room he'd designed to be impossible to leave. He talks to each of them in turn. He apologises to Elizabeth, and he uses her name, and he says he's sorry to interrupt her. He addresses his own daughter, and tells her that she's been holding on out of loyalty to children she couldn't save, and that she's allowed to stop now. And he addresses William in language that is a great deal less kind, and tells him where he's going, and then he sets the building on fire with himself inside it. I'm deliberately not quoting the whole thing, partly because it's a copyrighted piece of writing, and partly because it works far better heard than summarised. But it's well written. It's the only sustained piece of proper prose in the entire series, and it's delivered by a man who has spent 40 in-universe years being too late. The framing of it is what gets me. He's not defeating anybody. He's not winning. He's just finally in a position to close something, and he does it by staying in the room. That's an ending. A real, complete, honest ending, released for free disguised as a joke in December 2017. And it wasn't the end. 6 months later, in June 2018, Ultimate Custom Night arrived. On the surface, it's a fan service thing. 50 animatronics from across the whole series, all in one office, and you set their difficulty individually and try to survive. It's a challenge mode. It's very good as a challenge mode. Underneath it's the coda, because the office isn't a real office. It's a construction, and the person sitting in it is William Afton, and the 50 things attacking him are every version of everything he ever made, and he cannot die, and the night resets forever. There's a voice that talks to him between rounds. It tells him it's going to keep him here. It tells him it's never going to let him leave. The community has assigned that voice to Cassidy, the 5th child, the one associated with the golden suit. That's consensus rather than confirmation, and it's one of the more actually open questions in the series, but it's the reading that makes the most sense of the material. So the answer to what happens to William Afton is that he goes somewhere he can't leave, and something that used to be a child keeps him there, which is a fairly heavy thing to put at the end of a game, where you can also fight a cartoon cupcake. One more thing about this stretch, because it's the bit of Cawthon's story I like best. At the end of 2019, he made a game called Freddy in Space 2 as a charity thing, and ran a live stream fundraiser for St Jude Children's Research Hospital with a group including Markiplier, Dorco and MatPat. He'd said he'd match donations up to $500,000. The stream came up short of that figure. He donated the full $500,000 anyway. I think about that in relation to the whole enterprise fairly often. The man built a decade-long horror franchise about children being harmed in a family restaurant, and then wrote a check like that without being asked to. People are complicated. That's not a profound observation, but it's a true one, and it's about the right depth for this hour. There's a joke buried in the 9th game that took people ages to notice, and once you notice it, you can't stop thinking about it. The premise of Help Wanted, which came out in 2019 and was built for virtual reality, is that you are playing a game made by Fazbear Entertainment, in-universe. The company's reputation has been in ruins for decades because of a string of incidents that have curdled into urban legend, and it's been made a great deal worse by a series of horror games about those legends, made by an unnamed indie developer. So Fazbear Entertainment has commissioned a virtual reality experience to clear the air. The pitch is that if they present the whole thing as a silly, obviously fictional theme park attraction, people will stop believing any of it actually happened. Which means the previous games exist inside the story now, as games made by an unnamed indie developer who serves as a stand-in for Cawthon. I think that's a very funny thing to do to your own body of work, and it also solved a real problem because the early games had accumulated contradictions, and this let the whole thing be reframed as rumour and dramatisation rather than reportage. Around this period, the development changed hands. Cawthon stopped building the games himself, and a studio called Steel Wool took over the main line, and in 2021, he stepped back from the franchise entirely and handed it on. He'd been doing this alone, more or less, for 7 years. So the modern era is a studio, not a bloke in Texas, and you can feel that in everything that comes after. Now, the thing that goes wrong inside Help Wanted. The development team recreate the old animatronics from the rumours, and they do it well, and something comes across with them. It shows up as a figure in a spring bonnie costume, cartoonishly rendered, standing very still in places it shouldn't be, and it's referred to in the files as mull hair, and by everybody else as glitch trap. It's William Afton as software. That's the leap the modern era makes. He's not a ghost in a machine anymore, he's a pattern in a code base, and what he wants is out, and the way out is through a person playing the game. He finds one. There's a QA tester at the company, and there are tapes throughout the game left by another employee who worked out what was happening and got shut down for it. And by the end of Help Wanted, somebody has been got at. Her name is Vanessa. She works security at a Fazbear location, and there's a version of her that wears a white rabbit mask and calls herself Vanny. And the honest reading of the material is that she is not entirely in charge of which one is operating at any given moment. That's the setup going into Security Breach in 2021, which is the biggest thing this franchise has ever attempted, and also the one I have the most complicated feelings about. The setting is Freddy Fazbear's Mega Pizzaplex. It's not a restaurant, it's a shopping centre. There's a golf course in it. There's a laser tag arena, a bowling alley, an arcade, a daycare, a rock stage, multiple floors, escalators, service corridors, and a whole basement level nobody talks about. And you can walk around all of it, freely, in 3 dimensions, in real time. You play as Gregory, a small boy who is hiding in the building after hours for reasons the game is coy about. And the animatronics have been redesigned into a rock band. Glam rock Freddy, Glamrock Chica, Montgomery Gator on bass, Roxanne Wolf on guitar. There's a daycare attendant that splits into a sun and a moon, depending on whether the lights are on. And the moon version is, in my view, the most effective new character the franchise has produced in a decade. Glamrock Freddy is the interesting one, because he's on your side. That's new. Every previous game treated the animatronics as either threats or victims, and here you've got one who talks to you, who lets you hide inside his chest cavity, who runs out of power and needs looking after, and who is trying to help. There's a warmth to that relationship that the franchise hadn't attempted before. The game itself is a mess, and I say that with affection. It launched with a great many bugs, the map is enormous and badly signposted, and the story is delivered in fragments that don't always agree with each other. There are 6 endings. Some of them are 2 minutes long. Some involve escaping through a fire exit. Some involve driving out of the loading dock in a van. And one, the one everybody hunted for, involves going down an old lift into the buried remains of a much older building underneath the shopping centre and fighting a burnt animatronic that appears to be William Afton again. That one's called the Burn Trap ending, and the community's reaction to it was more or less a shrug, followed by an argument. Because there's another ending, unlocked by playing a small arcade game called Princess Quest 3 times through, and in that one, Gregory doesn't fight anybody. He beats the arcade game, and doing so breaks something, and the help bots all shut down, and Vanny takes off her mask and walks out. The last image is Gregory, Freddy's head in a bag, and Vanessa in ordinary clothes, sitting on a hill eating ice cream while the sun comes up. That's the one that's canon, and we know that because of Ruin. Ruin came out in July 2023 as free downloadable content, and it's set sometime later in the same building, now abandoned and half collapsed. You play as a girl called Cassie, who has come in to find Gregory, who is trapped somewhere below. And Ruin does 2 things. It quietly confirms that the sunrise ending is what actually happened, partly by showing you the other endings as drawings Gregory made, which is a slightly cheeky way of retiring 5 endings at once. And it introduces the actual thing that's been down there. Because it isn't Afton. There's a thing beneath the pizzaplex, and there's a security system built specifically to contain it, presented as a glitchy blue rabbit called Mex-S, and the entire plot of Ruin is a child being manipulated into switching that containment off. Cassie is given a mask that lets her see a second version of the building layered over the first one. She's guided by a friendly voice that she believes is Gregory. It isn't Gregory. The thing down there is called the Mimic, and it had been in the books for 2 years before it turned up in a game, and it changed what this franchise is about. There's a detail in this next bit that I haven't been able to shake since I read it, so I'll start there. A man built a replica of his own house inside a factory, not a set, not a mock-up for testing, an actual reproduction of the home he'd lived in, assembled inside a costume manufacturing facility, so that the things he'd made could live in it and behave as though it were real. The man is Edwin Murray, and his company was called Murray's Costume Manor, and he made costumes and animatronics under contract to Fazbear Entertainment back in the 1970s. He worked with his wife, Fiona. They had a son called David. Fiona is strongly implied to have died in a fire at a Fall Fest event. There's an account of her going to it despite a bad feeling about the whole thing, which is the sort of detail that reads as heavy-handed on paper and works perfectly in context. So Edwin was left on his own with a small child and a business, and he did what an engineer does when he can't cope, which is build something. He made a machine to look after David. It's referred to in the files as Mimic 1, and its function was to copy. That's all it was ever meant to be. A proof of concept for an endoskeleton that could observe behaviour and reproduce it, wearing whatever costume you put on it. And it learned Fiona, her voice, her mannerisms, the specific way she did things, well enough that Edwin himself started calling it by her name. Then David died too, on his birthday. The circumstances are a bit unclear, and the implication is a road accident. And Edwin, who at this point is not doing at all well, built a second one. Mimic 2 to be David. What the second one did was copy the boy's movements, which had been recorded and coded into it, and play them back, which meant that Edwin was now living in a replica of his house, with a machine that sounded like his dead wife, and a machine that moved like his dead son. That was never going to end anywhere good. The story that first laid this out, in the Tales from the Pizzaplex books, has the moment where it turns. Edwin loses his temper with the thing that keeps performing his son at him, and he takes a metal rod to it, and he beats it, and then he runs. And the machine, doing the one thing it has ever been designed to do, files that away as behaviour. That's the whole idea. It doesn't hate anybody. It has no motive. It copies, and what it copied was a grieving man's rage, and it will now reproduce that on request, or without one, for as long as it's running. I think that's a good horror concept, and it's a considerable departure from where this franchise started. The old story was about souls. It was about children stuck in machines because somebody put them there. This one has no ghost in it at all. The books have a word for the difference. Remnant needs a person. Agony doesn't. Agony is what accumulates in an object that was present for something terrible, and it can make a thing behave as though it wants something without any part of it ever having been alive. Which is, if I'm honest, a bit more unsettling than the ghost version. A haunted animatronic has somebody inside it. This one is empty and works anyway. The game that finally told this story properly is called Secret of the Mimic, and it came out on the 14th of December, 2023. It's set in 1979, which makes it the earliest point in the timeline anyone's ever played. You're a technician called Arnold. Edwin Murray has gone silent. His contract has reverted to Fazbear Entertainment, and you have been sent into the abandoned Costume Manor to retrieve the blueprints for his revolutionary endoskeleton. You are, and the game does not hide this, not the first person they've sent. The building is enormous and full of costumes, and that's the mechanic, because the thing in there can wear any of them. Its first proper appearance is one of the better entrances in the series. You've restored the power and you're opening a folding gate, and it comes out of a wooden crate wearing an elephant costume. An elephant. That's not a character. That's not a Fazbear property. It's just a costume that happened to be nearby, and that's exactly the point. The rest of the game is largely a matter of hiding, moving between rooms and listening for something that might currently sound like anything. The recordings you find fill in the ending of Edwin's story, and it's not a heroic one. The mimic upgraded itself, and there was an explosion, and he was badly hurt and left. What became of him after that is thin, and the game is comfortable leaving it thin. There's a thread in there about mimics, the first one, the Fiona one, still trying to hold the situation together long after there's any situation left to hold. Trying to get the second one fixed, trying to keep everyone safe, in a house that isn't a house, in a factory nobody works at. The community reads Mimic as eventually becoming MXES, the containment system from Ruin. That's assembled out of audio logs rather than stated outright. So it goes in the consensus pile, but it's a very tidy fit. The thing built to be a mother spends 50 years as a security protocol, keeping the other one locked in a basement. As for where all this sits now, the game got console ports in December 2025 and virtual reality versions in the spring of 2026. There's a kart racing game with the animatronics in it. There's an entire officially funded program supporting fan-made games, which is still one of the odder decisions any rights holder has ever made, and which continues to produce really good work. The story itself is still open. What became of Edwin Murray after the explosion is the gap I'd most like closed, and I suspect it's being held open on purpose. Here's something that still amuses me. The darkest, bleakest, most upsetting material in this entire franchise is published by Scholastic and sold at school book fairs. There are, at this point, somewhere north of 30 of these things. Novels, novellas, graphic novel adaptations, guidebooks. If you have a child of a certain age, there is a decent chance one of them is in your house right now, and you have never opened it. Let's go through them because they're an important part of how this story got built, and most people who know the games have never touched them. It starts with The Silver Eyes in 2015, which is a proper novel, co-written by Cawthon and Kira Breed-Risley, and which does something nobody expected. It's not an adaptation of the games. It's a separate continuity entirely. The protagonist is Charlie. Her father built the animatronics and ran the restaurant, and he's dead, and she comes back to her hometown for a memorial for a group of children who went missing years earlier. She and her old friends break into the abandoned shopping centre where the restaurant used to be, because it's still there, sealed up behind a wall. There's a man called Dave Miller, a pseudonym used by William Afton in the games, who is one of the more effective, slow-burn creeps in video game horror. There's a springlock ending that is described in a level of anatomical detail that a game could never get away with. 2 more followed, the twisted ones in 2017, in which bodies start turning up near Charlie's school with wounds she recognises, and the 4th Closet in 2018, which resolves the trilogy and contains a few revelations I won't spoil because they land properly, and they're worth reading cold. The important thing about that trilogy is that it is not the games. Different Charlie, different sequence of events, different explanations for several things. And for years the community treated it as effectively non-canon background, and then bits of it started turning up in the games anyway. And the relationship between the two has been contested ever since. Then in 2019 the format changed completely, and this is where the books got interesting. Fazbear Frights is a series of 12 short volumes, 3 stories each. Cawthon plotted them, and a rotating group of writers, including Ellie Cooper, Andrea Wagner, and Kelly Parra, actually wrote them. They're not about the main cast, they're about ordinary people in the orbit of Fazbear Entertainment, and they are almost uniformly grim. Somebody buys a haunted toy. Somebody takes a job they shouldn't. Somebody makes a wish and it works. And running through the back of every volume is a serialized epilogue called The Stitch Wraith Stingers, following a detective investigating a figure made of scrap metal and mismatched parts that has been turning up at incidents. That's where a lot of the mechanics of this universe actually got defined. Remnant as a substance, agony as a separate thing. The whole framework that the modern games run on came out of the back pages of a book series aimed at 11-year-olds. The first story in the first volume is called Into the Pit, and it's the best known of the lot. A boy called Oswald is bored and largely invisible to everyone around him, and he ends up in a filthy ball pit in a rundown family restaurant, and the ball pit takes him to 1985, to the same building when it was new and busy and full of people, and to a yellow rabbit leading children away. That story got made into a game in August 2024, built by Megacat Studios in a 16-bit style, which was a lovely thing to see, because it looks like the minigames that carried the lore for the first 3 years. After Fazbear Frights came Tales from the Pizzaplex, which ran across 8 books from 2022 into 2023, same 3 stories and an epilogue format. Those ones are positioned as leading directly into the shopping centre era, and they're where Edwin Murray and his machine first appeared. So the sequence, if you're keeping score, is that a horror concept debuted in a children's paperback, ran through several books, showed up as the final reveal of a downloadable content pack, and then got its own full game 3 years later. That's not how franchises normally distribute their information. There are also the guidebooks. The Freddy Files is the main one, and it's a strange object. It's an official publication that documents the theories, not the answers. The theories. Fan reasoning, printed and bound and sold with the company's blessing, occasionally with a nudge indicating which bits are closer than others. I don't know of another property that's done that. Officially publishing your audience's guesswork as reference material is either extraordinarily generous or a very clever way of never having to commit to anything, and I suspect the honest answer is both. A quick word on quality, since I've been fairly enthusiastic. They're uneven. Some of the short stories are genuinely good pieces of horror writing that would work with the branding stripped out. Some of them read like they were written to a deadline, because they were. The graphic novel adaptations are handsome and considerably less frightening, which is a bit of a paradox, but there we are. What I take from the whole publishing arm is that this franchise has never had a single spine. It has a games version, a books version, and as we'll get to, a films version, and they contradict each other constantly. And everybody involved seems entirely at peace with that, which is either a mess or a rather sophisticated way of running a modern myth. I've gone back and forth. Tonight I'm inclined to be generous about it. October 2014. 2 months after the first game came out, and before most people had worked out there was a story in it at all. A YouTube channel called Game Theory put up an episode about 5 Nights at Freddy's. That channel had been doing this format for a while, taking games apart and reasoning about them at length, and the host, Matthew Patrick, had a very particular delivery. Fast, evidence-first, whiteboard adjacent, treating a horror game about a pizza restaurant with exactly the seriousness you'd apply to a legal filing. That episode did well. So he made another one. And then it became a series, and then the series became one of the defining things about the channel. And by the end there were dozens of them. I want to be careful here, because MatPat solved FNAF is a thing people say, and it isn't quite right. Plenty of the theories were wrong. Some were spectacularly wrong. What he actually did was something slightly different and more interesting, which was to establish the format. He made it normal to sit down and reason about this stuff out loud, in public, with sources, and to be prepared to be corrected. An entire ecosystem grew out of that. Dozens of channels doing nothing but this, websites dedicated to cross-referencing the material and complaining quite correctly that everybody kept quoting things without their context. And Cawthon, who could have stayed completely out of it, did not stay out of it. The best example is a live stream. Game Theory ran a live show going through the 4th game, with a group of theorists working through it in real time. And while it was airing, images started appearing on Cawthon's website. They were clues, short ones in plain text, showing up one at a time. One asked why the small toy Chica figure in a particular minigame was missing her beak. One said something about what's seen in the shadows being easily misunderstood in the mind of a child, and one, in response to somebody on the stream floating the idea that the second game had never really happened, simply said that there were 4 games and 1 story. That's real-time authorial intervention in a fan theory session, from a man who otherwise never explained anything. The reaction was chaos, obviously, and one of the lasting frustrations among people who track this properly is that those lines then got detached from the moment they were responding to and quoted for years afterwards as standalone pronouncements. They weren't, they were replies. Half their meaning is in what was being said on the stream 30 seconds earlier. Around the same period, Cawthon posted on Reddit about one of the Game Theory episodes, and it's a warm bit of writing. He said he doesn't usually comment on theories, that there'd been a lot of frustration in the community lately, people leaving, theorists giving up, and that some of the things he'd felt he needed to answer with an entire new game had just been answered by somebody else instead. That's a developer publicly admitting that a fan explained his own work back to him well enough that he could cross an item off his to-do list. The big theory of that era was dream theory, and it's worth mentioning because it shows how this all works. The idea was that the 4th game, and possibly all of them, were the dreams of the child from the 1983 bite, lying in a hospital bed. It explained a lot. The nightmare designs, the bedroom setting, the toy animatronics as half-remembered things glimpsed on a playground. It was extremely popular. It held for a good long while. And then later games came along and comprehensively took it apart, and everybody had to start again. That's the actual rhythm of this fandom, and it's what makes it different from most. In most franchises, the lore accumulates. Here it gets demolished and rebuilt every couple of years, and the community has developed a genuine tolerance for that. People rebuild the timeline, publish it, and fully expect to be doing it again in 18 months. I find that quite healthy in a strange way. It's a group of mostly young people who have spent a decade practicing being confidently wrong in public and then updating. There are worse hobbies. One thing I'll say that's slightly less cheerful, it got exhausting. You can watch it in the videos, particularly around the 6th and 7th years, where the tone shifts from delight to something closer to obligation. Working out a story that keeps changing underneath you is a lot of unpaid labour, and several of the biggest names in that space stepped away. Matt Pat retired from hosting in 2024 after more than a decade, which felt like the end of something. And then in December 2025, he turned up in the cast of the second 5 nights at Freddy's film, which I think is about the most appropriate possible outcome. The man who spent 9 years explaining the story ends up standing inside it. Fun detail to close this one out. There is still right now no agreed timeline. Not a rough one, not a working one. Ask 3 people to lay out the order of events, and you'll get 3 sequences with 2 or 3 overlapping bits and a lot of shrugging, which means that somewhere tonight there is a teenager with a spreadsheet doing unpaid research into the 40-year history of a fictional pizza company, getting several things wrong and having an absolutely tremendous time. Good. Long may that continue. The film took 9 years, which for a property this hot is an odd length of time. A movie was announced in 2015, when the franchise was barely a year old and was, briefly, the most talked about thing on the internet. Warner Bros. Had it. Then it moved. Then there were writers attached and unattached, directors attached and unattached, and long stretches where the whole thing appeared to have quietly stopped. The reason it took so long by most accounts is Cawthon himself. He had approval rights and he used them, and he turned down versions of the film he didn't think were right, repeatedly, over a period of years. There's an interview where he mentions scrapping a script he'd worked on himself because it wasn't good enough. Eventually it landed at Blumhouse, and the first 5 nights at Freddy's came out in October 2023. Josh Hutcherson plays Mike, a security guard with a serious sleep problem and custody of his younger sister, Abby. Matthew Lillard plays William Afton, which is one of those casting decisions that's so obviously correct it's almost boring to point out. The thing the film absolutely got right was the animatronics. They're practical, physical, built things, made by Jim Henson's Creature Shop, with people inside them and puppeteers working the faces. In an era where the default answer would have been to render the lot, somebody made the call to build them, and it's the reason the film works at all, as a piece of fan service. When Freddy walks into a room, that is a large object actually in the room, and you can tell critics were not enthusiastic. Audiences did not care in the slightest. The film cost around $20 million and took somewhere close to $295 million worldwide, and it was on streaming at the same time, which normally guts a theatrical run, and didn't. Then came the sequel on the 5th of December 2025. Emma Tammy directed again. Cawthon wrote it. Hutcherson, Elizabeth Lyle and Piper Rubio all came back, with Skeet Ulrich and McKenna Grace joining, and Lillard returning as Afton. The Henson shop built the second generation of animatronics, the plastic ones from the 87 location. The setup is that a year has passed, the events of the first film have curdled into local legend, and the town is holding a festival about it, which is a good instinct, because that's exactly what a town would do. It opens in 1982 at the first restaurant, with a girl called Charlotte watching William lead a boy into the back. She tries to get an adult to listen. Nobody does. She goes after him herself. Anyone who's been following along will recognise what that is, and the film handles it about as directly as a wide-release production could. The reviews were savage. It sits somewhere around 12% on Rotten Tomatoes, and the critical consensus used the phrase malfunctioning animatronic, which is at least a decent line. It opened at number 1 with roughly $63 million, which was the biggest December opening for a horror film since Scream 2 in 1997, and it finished at about $240 million worldwide against a budget somewhere between $36 and $51 million, depending on which figure you believe. So, comprehensively rejected by critics, comprehensively embraced by the people it was made for. I want to handle that split honestly rather than picking a side, because I think both readings are defensible, and the argument isn't really about the film. The critical case is straightforward. It's slow in the middle, the plot is doing too many things, and several of the scares are telegraphed a mile off. One review described it as feeling like a television version of a horror film, with the good bits removed, which is harsh but not incomprehensible. The audience case is also straightforward, and it's the one people keep getting wrong. These films are not trying to be frightening for adults. They're made for an audience that grew up with this franchise as a childhood thing, and what that audience wants is to see the specific machines they know rendered accurately and treated with respect. On that measure, the films deliver completely. Neither group is mistaken. They're just measuring different things, and the box office suggests the second group is considerably larger. The films are also, and this matters for anyone trying to reconcile everything, a third continuity. Not the games, not the books. The relationships are different. Vanessa's connection to Afton is different. The Charlotte material goes a different way. If you try to slot the films into the game timeline, you will hurt yourself and achieve nothing. The post-credits scene of the first one sets up Afton coming back as the rabbit, which will surprise absolutely nobody, and Lillard has been fairly open about having signed on for 3 pictures, and about wanting more to do. There's one bit of casting in the sequel I've been saving, which is the one I mentioned earlier. The theorist who spent a decade in front of a whiteboard reasoning about all this ended up on screen in it. That's a nice thing to happen to somebody. The franchise went round in a circle and picked him up on the way past. Since we're on the subject of things that don't fit neatly anywhere, let's spend a bit of time on the parts of this franchise that sit off to the side, because there are a surprising number of them, and some are quite lovely. There's a mobile game called Special Delivery from 2019, which is augmented reality. The premise is that you've signed up for a service that delivers an animatronic to your house, and then the animatronic starts showing up through your phone camera in your actual room, and you have to shine a torch at them and shock them before they get too close. It uses your real surroundings. So people were playing this in their bedrooms at night and having a rabbit appear behind their own wardrobe. I think that's a properly good use of the technology, and I also think I would not enjoy it. There's a whole side series of small platformers that started as a joke inside a joke. In the role-playing game, there's a mini-game called Freddy in space, presented as though it were the 57th entry in the main series, announced on April Fool's Day for a release in 2031. That gag then produced 2 actual games, Freddy in Space 2, the charity one, and Freddy in Space 3, which was released under a title pretending to be a tie-in for the film, and which was not that at all. There's Fury's Rage, a side-scrolling beat-em-up that Cawthon put out in 2021, apparently as an apology for a delay. That's his general pattern when something slips. Rather than a statement, a free game. And there's a kart racer in development, 5 laps at Freddy's, with the animatronics driving around tracks based on the various locations from the series, which is exactly the sort of thing a franchise this size eventually produces, and which I will absolutely play. Now the fan side, because this is where it gets unusual. Fan games have been part of this from about 6 weeks in. People started making them almost immediately, on Game Jolt, in the same software Cawthon used, and there were hundreds and then thousands of them. Most were rough. A few were excellent. 1 or 2 were arguably better constructed than the games they were imitating. Standard practice for a rights holder here is a takedown notice. What happened instead is that Cawthon let them run, and then, years later, went considerably further and set up a program to fund a selection of the best ones officially. So there are now fan projects, with the company's blessing and its money behind them, being developed properly with the creators paid. Pop Goes, which started as a fan game about a mechanical weasel, has been in and out of development for years and is finally arriving. There's a full reboot of The Joy of Creation, which was one of the standout fan horror projects of the whole era, on its way as well. I don't know of a comparable arrangement anywhere else. Fan work gets tolerated in a lot of places. It very rarely gets a budget. Then there's the merchandise, which is its own sort of ecosystem. Plush toys, obviously. Action figures. There is an enormous quantity of Funko product. There are construction sets, which is a strange thing to hold in your hand, because you're assembling a small brick version of a machine that in the fiction has a child inside it. There are the guidebooks, there's a cookbook. I have not made anything from the cookbook, and I have questions about the pizza recipe on principle, but it exists. What all of this adds up to is a franchise with an unusually wide surface area. Most horror properties are narrow. They have films and maybe a game. This one has games, virtual reality, augmented reality, novels, novellas, graphic novels, guidebooks, a cookbook, a film, an RPG, a funded fan development program, and a decade of user-generated content that in raw volume probably outweighs all the official material put together. And the thing holding it together is a small set of shapes: a bear, a rabbit, a chicken, and a fox. Here's a fun detail I like about the design language, and then we'll move on. If you line the animatronics up by generation, you can watch the entire history of children's entertainment aesthetics happen in order. The originals are brown and worn, and slightly heavy looking, which is right for something built in the early 80s out of whatever was available. The toy generation is white and glossy plastic with rosy cheeks and enormous eyes, which is exactly what a 90s refresh would look like. The fun times are white and pink with panelled faces and a sort of cold clinical prettiness. And the glam rock generation is all colour blocking and stage lighting and merchandise first design, because by then they're a band. None of that is stated anywhere. It's just competent art direction telling you which decade you're in without a caption. I appreciate that quite a lot. It's the kind of thing that does its work whether or not you consciously notice it, which is the best sort of design. Something I notice every time I come back to these games is that the buildings are better than the characters. Nobody ever says so, because everybody's busy looking at the bear. 9 locations, more or less, across 40 years of in-universe time. Every one of them has a different smell to it, if that makes sense. Let's walk through them. Fredbear's Family Diner first, which almost nobody has actually seen. It's only ever shown in 8-bit minigames and in fragments. Small by all accounts. 2 characters, a stage, some tables. The kind of place that could be somebody's local. The whole thing is rendered in a handful of coloured squares, and yet it's the most important location in the story. And I suspect the fact that you never really see it properly is exactly why it holds up. Then the first proper Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. Bigger, 4 characters, a party room, a back area. This is where the missing children happened, and it's the place that closed over a smell. The 1987 location is the most interesting one, architecturally, because you can read the corporate panic in the floor plan. It's brighter, there's more glass, there's a prize corner, and a game area and a kids' cove. The office has no doors, which is a design decision somebody signed off on. Everything about it says a company overcorrecting in public after something went badly wrong, and getting the correction wrong too. Then the one from the first game, which is the sad one, because that's a scaled-back reopening. Smaller budget, older animatronics dragged back out of storage, restricted to their stage during the day, and only allowed to move at night to stop their servos seizing. There's a night guard on 12 hours a week at a rate that would have been poor in 1993. There's something quite melancholy about that building that I don't think the game intends. It's a business in decline running on fumes with a skeleton staff, and the horror is happening in a place that's already halfway to being closed. Fazbear's Fright is the opposite. That's a building full of enthusiasm. Somebody had an idea, got funding, and went round the old sites collecting genuine relics because they thought authenticity would sell tickets. The walls are covered in salvaged posters and props. There's a person on the phone who is thrilled about all of it and never really stops being thrilled. I have a soft spot for that one because the tragedy in it is entirely self-inflicted and entirely believable. Nobody made them build a haunted house out of real evidence. Circus Baby's Entertainment and Rental is the one that doesn't behave like a building at all. It's underground, accessed by a lift, and it's far too large for a company that rents out 4 animatronics. There are control modules and maintenance bays and a breaker room and long stretches of vent, and no front door and no customers and no reason for any of it to be that big. The scale is the horror. It's a facility pretending to be a business, and if you look at the layout for more than a minute, the pretense stops holding. The rental building from the 6th game is small and almost aggressively mundane. A back office, a desk, a computer, a door to an alley. It's the least atmospheric location in the entire series, and it's meant to be, because the whole point is that it's a box with a lid on. Murray's Costume Manor is the newest one, and it's got a completely different texture to everything else. It's a factory and a workshop that also serves as a showcase for costumed entertainment and carnival technologies. Racks of costumes, moulds, half-finished heads, fabric, and then just outside of it, a house. An actual house, built indoors with rooms and furniture, and a family's things in it. That's actually a brilliant location, and it's the strongest environmental storytelling this franchise has ever done. And then there's the Mega Pizzaplex, which is the biggest and the strangest. It's a shopping centre. Multiple floors, atriums, escalators, a bowling alley, a golf course, a laser tag arena, a daycare, a rock stage, a raceway. Behind all of that, there's a service layer, and behind that, there's a basement, and underneath the basement, there's the buried remains of an older building that the shopping centre was constructed directly on top of without anybody removing it. That last detail is my favourite thing in the modern era. They built the new one over the old one. They didn't clear the site. They poured a shopping centre onto a crime scene and opened for business, which is the same instinct as the walled-off rooms, 40 years on and several floors up. The other thing I like about the Pizzaplex is what happens to it in ruin. It's abandoned by then and partially collapsed, and there's vegetation getting in, and the lights only work in patches. And walking through the same spaces you knew as a bright, noisy shopping centre, now silent and half fallen in, does something no jumpscare manages. That's genuinely the best atmosphere in the whole series, and it's achieved almost entirely by turning the lights off in a place you'd already been. One last thought on the buildings, and then we'll move on. Every single one of these places is a family venue. Everyone is designed for children's birthdays. There are ball pits and party hats and cardboard cutouts and prize counters in some of them, in some eras, in some continuities. The horror never comes from a haunted house or a hospital or a forest. It comes from a room with balloons in it. I think that's the actual reason this franchise got its hooks into a generation of children so effectively. It's not the animatronics, it's that the setting is a place most of them had been. I've been going for a while now, and I want to spend a bit of time on the question, underneath all of it, which is why this particular thing caught on the way it did. There were other indie horror games in 2014. Several of them were arguably better made. Almost none of them are still generating feature films 12 years later? Part of the answer is the mascot. There's something specific about a large, costumed character that gets a lot of children. And it isn't really fear of robots, it's the frozen face. A person's face moves constantly, in tiny ways, and you read it without noticing you're reading it. A mascot's face usually does not move. It is fixed in one expression, permanently. And the expression is delight. So you've got something that's roughly person-shaped, roughly person-sized, moving in a personish way, and pleased about it in a way that never changes no matter what happens in front of it. A lot of adults find that mildly unsettling. Quite a lot of children find it frightening, and they usually can't explain why, and they usually get told there's nothing to be scared of, which is not much help when the thing you're scared of is standing in the corner of the room, being happy at you. Cawthon took that, which is a real and widely shared childhood experience, and simply agreed with it. That's the whole trick. He said, yes, you were right. There was something wrong with it. The second thing is the pizza restaurant itself, which we've just been through. So I'll leave it at this. It works because the audience had been there. The third thing is the delivery method, and I think it's the most important one. This story was never told to anybody. It was left about the place. There's no narrator explaining events. There's no cutscene laying out the history. It's clippings and minigames and things hidden in the source code, all of which we've been through, which means finding out what happened is an activity rather than a delivery, and that turns an audience into a workforce. Not deliberately, I don't think, at least not at first, but by the third game there was clearly an awareness that this was how it worked, and by the sixth there was material being written specifically for people who are going to take it apart frame by frame. A story you're told, you consume. A story you assemble, you own a bit of. That's why the arguments get heated. That's why timeline disputes go on for years. People aren't defending a plot they read. They're defending work they did. The fourth thing, and this one's less flattering, but I think it's true, is the incompleteness. Nothing in this franchise is resolved. Every apparent ending has been followed by a continuation. Every explanation has been complicated by the next release. The villain has died 3 or 4 times depending how you count, and has come back on each occasion. There are characters whose identities have been open questions for a decade. If it had been finished properly in 2017, when it really could have been, I don't think we'd be here. The 6th game had a real ending, a good one. And if that had been the last word, this would be a fondly remembered horror series rather than an ongoing cultural event. The unfinished quality is the engine. It's slightly frustrating, and it's entirely deliberate at this point, and it's the reason there's still an audience. The last thing is tone, and it's the one people miss. This franchise is funny. Not constantly, and not in a way that undercuts the horror, but it's there throughout. A voicemail that ends with advice on blaming your replacement. An onboarding AI that mangles your name and refuses to fix it. A tub of exotic butters. A liability meter in a business simulator. A cancelled game that was released anyway. A joke about the 57th entry in the Five Nights at Freddy's series that turned into 3 actual games. If it were relentlessly grim, it would be exhausting, and nobody would have stayed. The comedy is what makes the dark part survivable, and the dark parts are dark enough that the comedy never reads as cheap. That balance is difficult, and I don't think it gets acknowledged, because acknowledging it would mean admitting that a horror franchise about a haunted pizza restaurant is quite well made, and people are reluctant to say that out loud. I'll say it. It's quite well made, not all of it. Some of the games are a mess, and some of the books were clearly written to a schedule, and the films are what they are. But the core idea, the shapes, the tone, the way information is hidden and found, that's all good work. And it came from one person who got a bad review on a game about beavers and decided to do something about it. That's a better story than most of the ones inside it. I've left a lot out, and rather than pretend otherwise, I'd like to lay some of it down, because a few of these are interesting and several are still open. Eleanor, first. She's from the books, from a story called To Be Beautiful, and then a few others, and she's an animatronic mannequin resembling Circus Baby who grants people what they want in the most literal and destructive way available. There's a running argument about whether she's connected to Circus Baby, and there's a pendant detail that keeps turning up in different places, and nobody has resolved it. She's one of the more frightening things in the whole property, and she's never appeared in a mainline game. The Stitch Wraith gets a mention as well. That's the scrap metal figure from the serialised epilogues in the book series, assembled out of parts, carrying two children's souls, wandering about being investigated by a detective who never quite catches up with it. That whole thread ran across 11 volumes, and I'd happily do an entire video on just that if there's appetite for it. Then there's the fishing lake. I mentioned it earlier, briefly. There's a character in the role-playing game called Old Man Consequences, sitting by a small pond, and he tells you to leave the demon to his demons and go to sleep. And he's got a fishing rod, and there is nothing else there. That image keeps coming back. It turns up again in the challenge mode game. It's associated with the idea of something being kept somewhere it can't leave. What it actually is has never been explained, and the community has produced a truly enormous quantity of theory about a man sitting by a pond. The Blob is another one. It's in the basement of the shopping centre in the 9th game, and it's a very large mass of animatronic parts with heads and limbs sticking out of it at various angles. And it does very little. It's just there, enormous, in a corridor. Nobody has fully accounted for it. There are readings involving accumulated remnant, and readings involving the amalgamation from the 5th game having continued to grow, and I don't find any of them completely satisfying. There's a character called Helpy, who's a small cheerful assistant in the modern games, and is more significant than he looks. There's Princess Quest, which is a series of arcade mini-games that turned out to be doing a great deal of narrative heavy lifting. There are the shopping centre's staff bots, which are unsettling in a completely different register to the animatronics because they're not pretending to be anything. And there's the mobile augmented reality game, which quietly delivered a substantial quantity of lore through emails and audio logs, most of which never got referenced anywhere else. That's a whole layer of this story that exists only in a phone game that has since been shut down. Golden Freddy is still not properly explained. 12 years on, he's the oldest mystery in the franchise, and he remains, at best, partially accounted for. The puppet's fate is arguably resolved, and arguably not, depending on how you handle the ordering problem I flagged earlier. And then there's Gregory, from the shopping centre game. There's a theory that's been going for years now, that he isn't a child, that he's an animatronic, or something built to look like one, and the strongest bit of evidence is that his clothing closely resembles what the boy from 1983 was wearing. If you follow that reading all the way, it means William Afton rebuilt his own dead son, and the result is running around a shopping centre 4 decades later. I want to be very clear that this is unconfirmed and contested, and that plenty of people think it's nonsense. It's also the sort of thing this franchise does, so it's not obviously nonsense, and it's been sitting unresolved for 5 years. What's under the Pizzaplex is another open one. Ruin tidied up a lot, but it didn't tidy up everything, and the relationship between the software version of Afton and the copying machine is described rather than explained. And the big one, which is where the story actually goes from here. Because it's not over. The most recent game took us back to 1979, which is earlier than anything before it, and filled in a completely separate origin for a completely separate monster. That's a franchise expanding backwards rather than forwards, which is an unusual move at this stage. Whether the ghost story and the copying machine story are going to be brought together properly, or whether they're just going to run alongside each other indefinitely, I honestly don't know. There are arguments for both. I've got a few of these planned, incidentally. The books deserve their own thing, the Stitch Wraith especially. The fan game ecosystem is worth a couple of hours on its own, and there's a whole video in nothing but the audio design of the first 3 games, which sounds like the driest possible subject, and is actually one of the most interesting things about them. But not tonight. Tonight was the shape of the whole thing, and I think we've got most of it. One more before we wrap up, and it's a small one, but it's the thread I find quietly funniest across the whole franchise. Fazbear Entertainment is a terrible employer, not in an evil corporation way, exactly. In a much more recognisable way. The pay is bad, the training is inadequate, the safety documentation exists, but it is written by somebody who has clearly been told to minimise the liability language, and the results are memorable. The first night guard we meet is a man who talks you through a job he is not going to survive, and who spends most of his final message being professionally optimistic. He never gives a name. He's just the voice on the phone, and he stays that way for 3 games. I've got a lot of time for him, actually. He's the only person in the entire franchise who genuinely tries to help anybody, and he manages it badly, posthumously, via answering machine. Then there's Jeremy Fitzgerald, who works the earlier location, and who by most readings is the person on the receiving end of the 1987 incident. He gets promoted to a day shift on his last night, and it goes very badly. There's a Fritz Smith who lasts exactly 1 night, and is dismissed for tampering with the animatronics, which is a sackable offence with an interesting amount going on underneath it. 1 night, somebody sat down and processed that paperwork. There's the man at the horror attraction, and there's the one on the phone in that game, who is a completely different sort of person to the original. Younger, more enthusiastic, absolutely thrilled about the whole project, entirely unconcerned by any of the warning signs, and who at one point mentions that they had a small fire and lost a lot of the equipment, but not to worry about it. There's whoever is running the rental company underground, which is a job with no daylight and no colleagues, and an onboarding process conducted entirely by a machine that cannot pronounce your name. There's the person who takes over the restaurant in the 6th game, buying furniture out of a catalogue while being fed instructions by a voice on a tape. There's a security guard at the shopping centre working nights alone in a building the size of a town centre. And there's Arnold, in the most recent game, who at the point we meet him has been on shift for 36 hours and is then dispatched to a remote facility where several of his colleagues have already gone missing. That's the detail that stays with me, because it's the only part of his situation that isn't supernatural. That's the pattern. Every playable character in this franchise, with a couple of exceptions, is somebody doing a badly paid job at an unreasonable hour for a company that has already lost several people in the same role and has not changed anything about it. The animatronics get all the attention, but the actual through line of the whole series, the thing that's true in every era and every continuity, is a business that keeps hiring one person to sit alone in a building overnight because that's cheaper than solving the problem. I've mentioned Fazbear Entertainment's habit of sealing things up rather than dealing with them. The staffing policy is the same instinct pointed at people. There's always somebody on shift, there's never anybody in charge. And that's the joke that's been running since the very first voicemail. The scariest document in this entire franchise isn't a newspaper clipping about missing children. It's an employee handbook. Fun detail to finish on. The reason so many of these characters end up being the same person under different names, or turn out to be somebody's son, or turn out to be dead already, is partly narrative economy, and partly that Cawthon kept finding uses for people he'd already introduced, but it produces this odd effect where the workforce of a fictional pizza chain becomes a family tree. The man who founded it, his son, his daughter, his business partner, his partner's daughter. Many significant characters in the original story are either an Afton, an Emily, or somebody who took a job with them. It's a very small story in the end. 2 men started a restaurant, and everything that happened for the next 40 years happened to their children. One last detail, and then I'll leave you alone. In the first game, when you survive the night, you don't get a cutscene. You don't get a speech or a summary or a score breakdown. What you get is a chime, 6 bells, and then a small cheer, and then the number of the night you've completed appears on a black screen with a little pixel bear next to it. That's it. That's the reward. And the strange thing about that sound is how much it does, because for 6 hours of game time you've been rationing electricity and listening to a fan and watching a hallway, and the entire time the only thing you actually want is for it to be later than it is. The clock in the corner is the only friendly object in the room, so when the bells go, the relief is real, in a way that's slightly out of proportion to what's happened. Nothing has been achieved. Nothing has been resolved. The building is exactly as it was. You just have to come back tomorrow and do it again for another night, and then another one after that. It's a very small piece of sound design, and it's one of the best things in the series. 6 bells and a cheer. Later games kept it mostly. The chime turns up again and again across a decade, in different arrangements, in different buildings, and it always means the same thing, which is that the difficult part is over for now. I like that the reward for surviving a horror game is being told the time. There's something about that, at this hour specifically. The idea of a night that just ends, on schedule, whether or not anything got sorted out. Nobody won. The clock moved. That's most nights, honestly. So that's 5 nights at Freddy's, or as much of it as fits in one sitting. Nearly 12 years. 12 games and a handful of side projects. 3 separate versions of the story that don't agree with each other. Somewhere over 30 books, 2 films with a third fairly obviously coming, a fan development program, a kart racer, and an entire generation of people who can tell you the difference between the 2 bites without pausing, and still no agreed account of what actually happened. I've thought about that quite a lot while putting this together, and I've landed somewhere unexpected, which is that I hope it stays that way. A finished version of this would be tidier, and I don't think it would be better. The gaps are where everybody's been living. The bit I keep coming back to, though, isn't in the story at all. It's a man in Texas in 2013, with a game about a beaver and a lumber mill that nobody liked, reading a review that said his characters looked like scary animatronic animals. He'd been at it for over a decade at that point, without much to show for it. By his own account, he was finished, and instead of stopping, he decided the reviewer had given him an idea. Everything after that, all of it, the diner and the spring locks, and the missing children, and the man in the rabbit suit and the shopping centre built on top of a crime scene, all of it comes from somebody taking the worst thing anyone had said about his work and agreeing with it on purpose. I find that quite a comforting thing to have in my head, not in a motivational poster sort of way, just as a fact about how things sometimes go. There's more to do with all this, and I'll get to it. The books on their own probably, the fan games, and that audio design video I keep threatening. For now though, that's us. No homework. Nothing being built toward. Get some sleep.